Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really happy for this invitation to talk about some of the work we are doing in the Danish coastal areas, including Grønsten. And of course, it's not only me, we have also a group of researchers that are all putting the efforts together to get these findings that I'm gonna show today. So in this webinar, I want to show you, talk about some points that I'm showing here, just a brief intro on the tidal areas, what are they, what are the impacts on the hard protections on these zones. And when we talk about problems, we also have to think about solutions, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the nature-based solutions. What is this concept? I'm gonna show some examples, and here again, the managed realignment in Grønsten. And then I will end up with a summary and perspectives. So the coastline, the tidal areas. The coastline is not a line like we see in the map, right? It is a zone. And as you can see here in this scheme, these zones is called tidal areas. We have the supratidal areas, which is here in the beach ecosystem, here in the open coast, is where we have the influence of storms. Then we have the intertidal area, is where we have the high tide and low tide zone. And then we have the subtidal areas. And then these tidal zones, they are of course influenced by, in Denmark, by waves and winds. And in the intertidal areas specifically, we have vegetation growing on that is fed up by nutrients that comes from upland. And the same zones with more vegetation you can see also in the estuaries in Denmark. And these estuaries are fjords, right? All the fjord areas, they have the same tidal areas. So just to think about that, the coast is not only a line, is also a zone, and this zone is very dynamic. And then I want to talk about the importance of these zones. And again, there is a continuum from land and sea when we think about the rivers and the estuaries. So it's important connections between the land and the coast. And all the things that will happen land will influence the coast in some way or another. And then when you go think about the tidal zones, they provide a lot of ecosystem services. They provide fine particles retention because some vegetation grow in these areas, which trap these particles, and because of that, there will be a natural elevation of this ground until a certain point where they will migrate seaward towards the water. And because of that, they offer some protection from erosion. So this vegetation will also take nutrients from that is being available in the area. And when we think about salt marshes, they will also, in some time, sequester CO2. And all these provide good conditions for biodiversity. So the vegetation here in the right, you can see the tidal marshes in Bay of Cadiz, how vegetated they are, in so much creeks and tidal channels, and they provide a lot of habitat for animals and fish and birds. And here's just a photo of a salt marsh in the landscape in balanced conditions, how they should look. This is in a picture in USA. I also show some Danish tidal areas, and I choose specifically to show some example in the western coast, where we have the tidal regime there is not as large as in the west coast, but these zones, they are still present and they are still important. So here we can see in Dette some tidal zones here, salt marshes, also with these creeks, tidal creeks and vegetation. And here we can see in northern Jutland in Helson some tidal areas, which are more or less managed, because if they grow too much, they have to be cut so they don't interfere with the ocean view. So just some examples. We have in Denmark is a relatively flat country, right? When I moved to Denmark, I was like, oh, there's very little mountains. I was used to see a lot of mountains in the landscape, but then I got used to the flat areas. And this has a lot to do with the last ice age. The landscape was formed. These vulnerable areas to floating here, represented in the left, is these areas in dark gray here. And there are areas that are being kind of uplifting slowly and very vulnerable to floating. And in the right here, we can see that we need to protect these areas of flooding and storms. And here I just show a map that I got from the Kystdirektoratet. And most of the coastal protections are dikes, and they sum up about 1,100 kilometers of the coastline. Here I use the term, but in green, you can see how much is distributed over Denmark. And of course, it's to protect the vulnerable areas to flooding and storm, but the question is, did these dikes were done on that time thinking about this dynamic zone that we have, right? So often the dikes, they are being put in the middle of the tidal zone and actually squeezing a little bit of these intertidal zones, which is, of course, can have some problems for when you think about the biology and the ecology of the system. But of course, the coastal defenses, they are one of the problems that we find in the coastal ecosystems. So back then in Denmark, there was land reclamation of these very low-lying areas. They have been drained and diked. But we also had infrastructure and technological growth, and that led to the city growth. We had more fossil fuel emissions, and then agriculture growth, the deeper plowing of soils, more drainage channels, straightening of rivers so the farms could feed. And also we had more and more coastal protections on that time. Because of this infrastructure growth, of course, we had problems with eutrophication later on, back in the 80s, 90s. There was more nutrient loading because there was more farming. That was also giving excess fertilizers to the coastal areas, and that leads to bloom of algae. And when these algae, they decompose, they take up oxygen and decreasing the oxygen and returning poor environmental conditions for the coast ecosystems. Right now, the Danish coastal areas, most of them are poor and moderate environmental conditions. And I think the last report of the water plane is that we jump from 3 to 5 good ecological conditions of these water bodies out of 109, if I'm not wrong. Then of course we have the global problem of climate change, sea level rise, storms, flooding, and warming and acidification. So when we think about the coastal ecosystems and the impacts, we have to think about all these factors that influence. And here I put in a separated way, but of course they are occurring simultaneously. And also there is different time frames. Of course, land reclamation was done in the end of 1800s in Denmark. Eutrophication, we had problems in 1990s, but it has been addressed in some way or another in climate change. It has started much before, but now is where we have to come up with actions, right? So I have summarized here and also in my report some of the impacts of coastal defense, going back to coastal defense in different categories. And you can see different colors of these little circles. And the habitat loss is by far the highest one in these tidal zones, the supratidal, intertidal, and subtidal. And then we have changes in soil biogeochemistry and release of nutrients and erosion. Then I broke down the types of coastal defenses in different ones, and sometimes you also modifications of the coast, such as land reclamation. So habitat loss is just by the physical act of having a dike or removal of the vegetation around not only coast, but streams. And if we look the dikes and land reclamation, we also have change in soil biogeochemistry. And what I mean with that is that when you drain an area that has been sea before, then you are exposing a soil to the air, and that will increase the CO2 emission in that sense, right? So it's a change in soil biogeochemistry. Sometimes the change in biogeochemistry can also be related to oxygen depletion in some areas. The release of nutrients is also by removal of vegetation to build up these coastal defenses. So the nutrients is not being taken up by this vegetation and released in the coastal areas, or it can also be in a short-term effect where you are, when during the building of these coastal defenses can have some consequences, right? So there's the short-term and the long-term effects. And erosion happens also by removal of vegetation, but also in the outside of dikes, because you are kind of building dikes very close to the lower part of the intertidal zone, and that will make a very narrow line of the beach or the coast outside. So you will have to constantly adapt and maintain these dikes. And turbidity is also related to removal of vegetation. So here's just an example in Vejle Fjord, water turbidity, and this is a dramatic example, I think. Very murky waters in the inner fjords, contrasting with some very nice buildings like the Fjordenhus. And this is, of course, caused by multiple effects, also the geomorphology of Vejle Fjord, but also because we are lacking vegetation in this area, right? It's very urbanized. Not only in the coastal areas, but also upland. We need to have more vegetation there. So, and that leads to cascade impacts on the ecological conditions in this area, because as you can see, we have very limited light. The water transparency is not very high. So some aquatic plants, for example, eelgrass, will not really thrive in these conditions. Of course, we have the salinity problem as well, but other macroalgae that will thrive in other coastal areas with a lot of light will not be growing here. And these are important ecosystems to have if you want biodiversity also in these areas. In a balanced condition with a lot of vegetation, you would expect some level of fine particles in the water, but not in this excessive amount as we observe here. But yeah, now I talk a lot about problems and impacts and consequences, and also the complexity of multiple stressors in the coastal zones. But is there any solution when you have to apply coastal defenses in some of the areas? And what would be the best strategy when you have to think about nature? And there are efforts, experts around the globe and also around Europe. They want to tackle this, what we call the double crisis of climate change and biodiversity. And especially in Europe, probably most of you know that we have the EU biodiversity strategy of 2030. We have to increase biodiversity by 30%. And also the EU climate adaptation mitigation strategy from 2050, where we have in Denmark to reduce our CO2 emissions by 70%, very ambitious. So, so how to tackle this when you also have to grow and have your economy in the same time? So that's why this concept of nature-based solution is coming more and more strong, and they are really emphasizes that that's how we should approach and address these problems. So basically, the nature-based solution concept is where we work with nature and with local communities and people to design our solutions to increase biodiversity. And that can be by protecting nature, restoring, managing, or creating nature. So then we benefit from the ecosystem services that these nature-based solutions provide. For example, greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We also have flood and erosion control. They can provide some level of coastal defense and so on and so forth. And that has to be under the umbrella of the sustainable development, right? Because we need to focus also on human well-being and biodiversity. So being more specific by the nature-based solution concept, there is a EU definition, and probably some of you already know that are solutions that are inspired and supported by nature. They are cost-effective and they provide environmental, social, and economic benefits to help build resilience. And here we are talking about resilience both to climate and biodiversity loss. And these solutions, they have to bring diverse nature into cities, landscape, and seascapes. So that is the main definition. But most, if you are planning, if you are working with planning of how to adapt to different climate change and other things, you probably have heard other nature-based solution related concepts. For example, forest landscape restoration, that is one of the oldest ones. So ecosystem-based adaptation, and all these is under they are nature-based solutions. And I mark the ecological restoration because it's some of the concepts that we are working a lot in the University of Southern Denmark. But ecological restoration also is related to ecosystem-based management. When we are working close to the coast, there's also the adaptation services that is related to. We also have to use some level of ecological engineering to plan and design our restoration. And we are also working with a whole ecosystem adaptation. So they are related to each other in some way or another. And yeah, of course, ecosystem-based mitigation as well, when we are working with habitats that can store a lot of CO2, for example, the salt marshes. Yeah, so I have, most of those concepts I showed before is heavily based on land and terrestrial systems and urban systems as well. And it's missing a lot of research, but we are hoping that we can fill up that gap about coastal and marine nature-based solutions. And in my report, I also show in the terms of ecological engineering and ecological restoration, what they could be. right? And some of them, they are coming actually from the mitigation measures for removing nitrogen from coasts, for example. For example, mussel farms, it's one of them. Then I broke into the ecosystem services that has to be present to be able to be classified as nature-based solution, and more ecosystem services that you cover, the better it is and more resilient your solution is, right? So we have this NA here is because there is not consensus yet in the scientific community whether these are providing, for example, carbon CO2 sink in the system. So if we focus on the salt marshes and soft sediments, eelgrass, you can see that most of them, they fulfill all the ecosystem services that is required for very successful nature-based solutions. When we look into the CO2 sink, I just put Danish forest plantations here as a comparison. You can see that salt marshes are by far the ones that are storing more CO2 compared to other systems. In soft sediments, here is managed realignment. That I mean, we also can have some sort of CO2 sink, but we can also combine managed realignment with salt marshes. Often when we make literature review, salt marshes are often associated to managed realignment. So so you can use combined approaches. You can also use stone reefs in the coast and associated with eelgrass. So there are many combinations that one will benefit the other in terms of being successful and recovering all the ecosystem services that are required. So my next exercise will be to put numbers on all of these green dots. So I will hopefully work on that later on. And there's also often a question, so how long does it take to these systems to recover once you implement them? Is also difficult. And this graph here I found is mostly on the survival of this vegetation and appearance in a restored area, for example. If you look seagrasses, there is a huge variation in terms of years, can vary from 5 years to 60 years. And salt marshes, they grow fast here in the scale of 20 years, but then again, until they provide the CO2 storage part, that can come up to 100 years. So there's huge variations, and more that you study, more you know and can estimate better this time. So, but what is managed realignment? I have mentioned a couple of times here in this presentation, but it's just to show you what it actually is. So we have a dike here and an area, and if you have this area here, you can use and you can restore as an intertidal area again by breaching this dike and building another inland dike here close to the supertidal area, let's say. And now I'm going to talk about our experiences with managed realignment and why that. So it provides ecological restoration of soft sediments and salt marshes, can be combined with other approaches, can bring biodiversity, has lots of benefits, right? High societal engagement because we have more birds coming, and it can account as a climate adaptation and mitigation. Also to show that in the last IPES and IPCC report, managed realignment is mentioned as a good solution when you think about coastal protection. And here I'm going to show some results of Gunsteinstrand, and that is a project that we have funded by Ove Jensen Foundation, and they have their goals here mainly to return marine nature and bird life, but they also think about climate and giving everyone a chance to experience nature and also public awareness. So that's how Gunstein looked before the manage realignment, and Bürgenstein is in Schön, close to Bodensee. And then after the dikes were breached, and there was also a lake that was done, which is also separated by a dike. So we had the coastal lagoon and a lake here in the bottom here. So what happens when you put water in agricultural soil? So the agricultural soil has lots of oxygen, and that is, the oxygen is used by microbes to decompose the organic matter, and that leads to a lot of CO2 coming out. But when you put water in, can also be the lake, you reduce the amount of oxygen in these soils or sediment. And because of that, you reduce also the amount of CO2. So you already have an immediate benefit of decreasing your CO2 emissions in that sense. And here's just a figure of what I already said. We have a lot of CO2 coming in agricultural soils. And when you cover with water, that is decreased. Here I'm shown with a smaller arrow going out. And sometimes we can even have some CO2 that is taken up by the small algae that grows on the surface of these soils. And that is because this black area here, the degradation or the decomposition is very, very slow process compared to agricultural soils, and when they have oxygen in the soils. Okay, so benefits of CO2 in Bürgenstein, what we have measured. Before the flooding, we had about 12,300 tons of emissions per year in that area. Then 1 year after flooding, 3,000, the system was still adjusting. And in 2019, we figured out that the coastal lagoon was CO2 neutral. Actually, there was an uptake of CO2 almost 500 tons. And we wanted to make this exercise and also include the lake to see actually if the lake has some benefits as well when we think about the CO2 sequestration, right? So we measure both CO2 and methane, and the methane was very high in the lake here, especially in the summer, because it's very temperature dependent, and we could make an assessment in comparison of these two water bodies, what was the benefits in terms of climate. So the blue numbers here is where we have uptake of CO2 for no negative emissions, and the red ones is where we have emission of methane, which is later converted to CO2 equivalents when you use the greenhouse warming potential. There we have actually emission of CO2 of about 9,400 tons per year. And that was almost the same as we had before flooding. So things to consider when we are working with managed realignment of coastal areas. But we also observed increase in biodiversity is increasing slowly in terms of macroalgae. This is in the coastal lagoon. And we also look into the animals. So we had, of course, mussels and worms. They had the period where they die. We had some adjusting problems in the lagoon, but now the mussels are coming back, and in 21 they are even higher. But we have lots of worms, so a lot of food for the birds and the fish. And we have voluntaries doing bird counts, and this is almost my last slide. I just have one more. And in total, the lake and the coastal lagoon, we have about 130 species of birds, including ducks and wading birds. And here just showing the increase in the common eider in the area in 2012 before the flooding, and then how it has increased all the way to 20 after the flooding. So summary. So the coastal defenses, they lead to loss of important tidal habitats, and then you lose the important ecosystem services of them. For example, nutrient retention, the trapping of fine particles, and natural protection to erosion. And if we are thinking about growth and what to do with coastal areas in the future, we should really integrate nature-based solutions. They can be complex, but then you need a very good panel of experts and also the local communities to design the best approach. And it will be also successful if you do nature-based solution considering what was the landscape beforehand, right? What was that tidal zone that was there beforehand? And you can do that also combining with the restoration of different coastal habitats. For example, managed realignment can be combined with salt marshes. It can also be combined with stone reefs and eelgrass. And managed realignment is an optimal nature-based solution when we think about the coastal lagoon. And it can be upscaled to other low-lying areas that we have around Denmark. So that was all from me.